Hey guys, Michelle from OG Rose. I'm so excited to be talking today with Sam Willman, and we are going to be talking on a myriad of things, but related to the phenomenology of space and how that is also impacted by different cultures and uh, engagements with the world, and particularly perhaps how maybe a more Eastern perspective thinks about things and maybe a Western perspective, though those aren't hard dichotomies. We tend to think of them that way, but just different regions of the world. How do we think about space? Um, and then also, how is that impacted by our digital age as well? And I guess I've always been really fascinated because I've lived in a city before in Spain, in Europe. And when I lived there, it was really interesting to live in a city from, I had been in a suburb with my family. Then I was living in a city in Spain. And now I live like out in the country. And I'm really fascinated by how the things that we visually see every day and that are around us, how they give us a sense of um, like a sense of ourselves and an understanding of like how we are designed because of like what design is around us, you know. And I think like when I lived in a city, everything was very like a lot more close by. You could walk to a lot of things and you could take public transportation and everything felt a lot more accessible, which I think in some ways was sort of like it did feel a bit empowering in a sense. Um, but it also probably gave me a bit more of a sense of control, which, you know, I don't know. I think getting into my more adult years, I realized how little there's so much that is outside of my control. But it's a good balance because there are things we control too, right? Just even just in terms of like our attitudes or, what we choose to do in a day. So, but I do think it's interesting, like how that can shift just because of what you're seeing every day and what you're around and what things you utilize and what spaces you find yourself in. And so I know that you have such a rich background with architecture. So what do you think is the relationship between like ourselves and our sense of self and what we like the spaces we're actually utilizing? And yeah, what were your thoughts, Sam?
Well, I think that's like a larger question that I have constantly been asking. And there's ways in which, like, I have like an intuitive sense on a lived level where I, where in an embodied way, like, that when you encounter like sharp things, sharp objects in your environment, like you have a certain stance towards them. And there's all these like little embodied ways of knowing. But then like to answer that question from a completely different angle also, like I think that our relationship to these things is really just it's so fundamental, and it's kind of a problem that like I've encountered just by nature of like I guess starting architecture school and stumbling up into this bigger problem where it's like um we're human beings and we build and there's nothing about, and animals do build. Beavers build dams and lodges, birds build nests, but it's not difficult to see that like we're building in a much different way than animals. And
Yeah.
how did that happen to us? And what are we doing that for? But I think that's a much bigger question, one that's very difficult to ask, but
Yeah.
it's one that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Um, like I think that a lot of our intellectual achievements as human beings is embedded in the spaces that we occupy. Like even just the fact that you're a child, and in if as an infant in 5 years time, in grade one you're going to be learning how to draw squares and define squares and understand squares, but you've been brought up in a square room your whole life. It seems like trivial and obvious, but at the same time there's like a comprehension of cubes that like a Western person is going to have a strong mastery of just by always living in them and living in orthogonal streets. And you know I don't know, maybe kids in the suburbs it's a little different because they're winding, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I really loved your Substack article when you really dug into this question of like, why are we building? Why? And I thought that was a really beautiful and big question, you know. I mean, I think that part of me, when I read the article, I was thinking like, there can be questions for me about, well, it seems as though if we think about just the way you're talking about how animals build too, there is some primal part of us that does it for shelter, right? Ultimately, like we build things because we need shelter, we need protection in some ways. We can't constantly be exposed to the elements. But how we build, with what we build, and the structures by which we build is what is fascinating, because we could actually build a lot closer to what more primal habitats are like, you know, with more earthen materials, et cetera. I mean, everything's ultimately going to be some sort of adaptation and whatnot from earthen materials, but it's like there's ways in which, you know, why is it that we, like, I think that something I see a lot, like thinking like you're saying about in the Western kind of, there's a lot of straight lines. There's a lot of compartmentalization, it seems, in types of like structures. And actually this came up in one of the net conversations that I thought was interesting, where Amelia was talking about like how we actually, I'm not sure from what type of like school of thought he was talking about, but just the general idea that it's not that we're like part of our environment, but we are our environment. And when you kind of have a greater awareness of the connection, like literally like our lungs and trees have, you know, the very similar structures and how they work together, there's almost something that can be very orienting, because you're like, I actually have a part of this larger ecosystem that is going through different seasons, and you are able to realize and accept change much more easily because you see the change in the seasons, you see all of that. And I brought up something about how I wonder if, because we, you know, yes, we need habitats and shelter, right? But there's a lot more of like being in indoor spaces, right? Houses with doors that every area is closed off, basically, and then you've got closed off within the closed off. That there's just structurally more room for isolation, you know. And so, just I was kind of saying, I wondered if that kind of does on us, I don't know if it's a psychosomatic or whatever level, like make us kind of distance ourselves from that larger ecology of being the environment. And then we feel kind of, we can potentially feel displaced. And honestly, it's possibly from our own doing of trying to protect ourselves, which ironically, not that we shouldn't have houses, but not which ironically makes us feel not at home in ourselves somehow. And so, and I think that's a very interesting thing. But I don't know, those are just some ideas that came to mind, because what would be interesting and Kafkaesque in the sense of like, we end up sort of defeating our own purpose in building, you know, because we do it for protection, if we just want to keep it on a very basic level. And then we end up like somehow in protecting ourselves, we've exposed ourselves to the troubles and potential woes and risks, or I want to say like sticky things that can pull you in isolation. So anyways, those are some thoughts that came to mind.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, first of all, the discipline of architecture has been, since the Enlightenment, very concerned with its own origin, because actually we don't really know much about the origin of building. We know that the oldest building, I think right now, the agreed upon oldest building is Göbekli Tepe, which is found in modern day Turkey. It's a circular, like monolithic, megalithic structure. And there's debate actually over whether or not it had a roof or not. I'm convinced, I'm more persuaded that it did not have a roof. And so it's like, what would a megalithic structure without a roof, how would that shelter you, you know?
Yeah, right.
But before this discovery of Göbekli Tepe, like in the 17th century, forget his name, he's a French theorist, but he, I don't know, I could look for him, but I won't. But this guy, it was his idea that that classical, the forms you see in classical architecture come from a primitive hut, which he had imagined being built out of wood. Often is the primitive hut is being depicted as being built out of wood, and you know, you have these logs as columns, and that actually columns and beams and I don't know, like domes or vaults, like that, architectural forms are actually just inherent to construction. And that it's just, those are the forms that we need to make shelter with, to shelter, and they just got better and better over time. But then you actually look at the history, like archaeology, and you're like, oh, okay, so the oldest known structure was a bunch of standing stones. So like, you know, how does that figure into this idea of shelter? And I think it's obvious that like humans would have been using like tools of shelter, and I think part of the history of the tools of shelter would be things like clothing as well, you know, like those really useful. And I think there are many, you know, we would have needed shelter, but I think that the discipline of architecture more rightly finds its origin not in a need for shelter or like an effort to shelter, but in something other. And I think personally that is, and I wrote about it in the Substack thing, I think it's not about sheltering the body, but about sheltering the future. And I think that by embedding intellectual achievements in built structures, in things which are enduring, we were able to use it as almost like use these spaces almost as learning tools to pass down these intellectual achievements like through generations, and allow for cultural evolution that like worked on a much faster time scale than biological evolution, in order to give us a lot of the cognitive skills that we possess today, and like the form of consciousness and like that we possess today. You know, like in ontogeny, I think, you know, so much goes into making an enculturated human being. Like, I think we really take it for granted, but just seeing children grasp things like, you know, you can, I'm without, I don't have children, but I love children. And, you know, you see them go from stages where when something is hidden, it disappears, to suddenly they're able to like understand that the object comes and goes. And these are just fundamentals, but like, and I'm not here to say that like, to try and say that like architecture allows progress per se, but I think it allows accumulation of cognitive like achievement. And sometimes things go by the wayside, you know, when they aren't preserved, you know, like things are forgotten. But putting things, embedding these things in the sites of our lives, in our settlements, was a really great way, I think, of keeping those things like with us. And so in that way, I see it as a sheltering the future, as well as sheltering the body, because architecture does. Now, when you get to the issue of like isolation, it's like, it's almost like we have sheltered ourselves to death sometimes. You know, like I went to a spa recently, had a nice week long at the spa, and part of the spa procedure is like ice dips, you know? And like, I think recent, like, this is more in the area of health rather than architecture, but like things like a recognition of like the microbiome in our guts, and things like this. We're realizing, yeah, there is a really strong continuity between ourselves and the nature that we like build ourselves away from, and the coldness that we, you know, we insulate ourselves against with building. It can actually be really good for us and part of essential metabolic processes. So I very much think you're right. Like it's like we discovered a tool. If I were to sort of recount a history of architecture up until this point, I would sort of characterize it as we discovered a tool that allowed us to like keep things with us. And then it was maybe like a bit of a Frankenstein that, you know, I think part of it was we forgot what we were doing, never knew what we were doing. And it grew into a monstrosity that now we're we're dawning on a consciousness of things that, like you and Daniel have talked about with ontological design, like these spaces are affecting us, and we just need to, I think, like be more aware and of like, now it's very difficult because I work in architecture too, and I don't actually think that a lot of what concerns me as a writer and in my thinking is very applicable to my job as a designer, you know, because it doesn't really guide, should we paint it red or should we paint it blue? It, you know, like design choices, it's really more of a question of like, should we build it all?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you brought up so many good things, Sam. So my question is about this idea that I love that you brought up on sheltering the future with building and architecture. And I guess I'm wondering, like, this idea of the cognitive facilities being, you said, like, talked about them being preserved and sort of passed along through structure themselves, through structure itself. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I'm curious on how I definitely understand on a very, I think, basic level, like how that would be a feedback loop, but how would certain types of structures or even paving or whatever it is, right? How would that sort of be able to communicate to others as they come along, as the generations come along, of a type of cognitive process of like becoming more encultured, is that the word? Like being more of a person who's able to have greater cognitive ability, you know? So just yeah, I'm just kind of curious a little bit more on that, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Again, looking at a much broader time scale than just like from here to yesterday, but like I think one of the big things is cylindrical structures. I mean, you see in archaeology a lot of structures align themselves to moments in time. And I think that really, again, it relates to where we sort of began the conversation. You know, talking about phenomenology of space and how that affects, and just phenomenology of times, how the two affect one another. You know, like it's a very difficult thing to sort of like imagine yourself living, say, I don't know, like 8,000 years ago. Like that's it. So, you know, it would be a completely different form of consciousness, you know. And so I think things like, like equinox and like equinox alignments and sun alignments, moon alignments, these would have been so important because we really need to remember, like, we're so used to living in like a clock time structured world that's just it is as much a construction as a building. And living with it's extremely powerful. And I think that it was cylindrical structures were like the beginning of harnessing that power. And I think what I've been finding very interesting recently is, well, I was reading a bit of Henri Bergson, and I was just looking at his critique of like modern science's conception of time. And just to summarize, it's basically like we think we measure time, but we don't measure time. We measure an abstraction of time, which he has called a simultaneity, which is essentially like we use things in space to represent change of time. And that makes sense because how else would we do that? You know, like a swing on a pendulum, we don't measure actually time because we're embedded in it. We just count a spatial change. And again, we derive so much cognitive, I want to say power, it sounds kind of like a weird way to phrase it, but cognitive power from like ways of abstracting the world. And I think I wouldn't posit this wholesale at this moment in time, but I'm beginning to suspect or find a resonance between architecture as being really involved in the cultural evolution of humans, and also the fact that, well, and especially for our own culture, we spatialize time. And I think the experiences that sort of accumulated in human experience, like in broader cultural human experience, was through engaging in architectures that did things like align, and did things like, we take for granted that like a column may be equidistanced, spaced equally. And if you're going to walk by them, you get a rhythm, a constant rhythm that you just wouldn't get when you're walking, say, by a tree, because trees aren't equispaced. So it would, the rhythm of coming into proximity with these things, we wouldn't have that, I guess, like uniformity of rhythmic spatial experience, in time as we're moving through it. Yeah. And then I guess also like just the fact that we were able to sort of conceive of Cartesian space is preceded by thousands of years of building orthogonally, and you've got the Cardo Decumanus of the Roman city, and eventually you just think the Cardo and the Decumanus, they exist. They are the structure of space. Like just add one more, the Z, and then you're at Cartesian space.
Yeah. That's really interesting. That's really good. Thank you for elaborating, Sam. And it makes me think that it's almost like we take these cognitive developments, and then it's almost like they're made in, there's something about like the fact that, and I'm not sure, maybe it's like people build stuff just because they're like, well, let's try this, or it's in somewhat of an experimental way of like, let's try this, or they have some sort of idea for what looks aesthetically pleasing, or what they think they'd like to have as a home or a space or a courtyard or whatever. And then somehow like how that's built itself, there's a way in which like now a cognitive process can almost be perceived, like it does change the ability, like it does impact our perception. Like what we perceive. Now we have another range of what types of perceiving we do, or what types of perceiving we intake or something like that. And so it almost is like a reinforcement of the cognitive process that either was spontaneously generated out of just curiosity and experimentation, or out of some sort of more deliberate thinking and planning and advancement of tools, because also certain things could only be made with certain types of tools that would allow you to make what you can make or build, and then therefore pass by or walk through or whatever. So that's really, really fascinating. And I do think like, yeah, Daniel and I have talked quite a bit about time and space and Bergson a lot. And there's kind of this interesting thing of, it's funny because time itself, we talk about like time passing, but it's more that things pass us by, like, or we pass by things. Like there's a lot of this idea of movement. And so it's space itself that seems to be the visual marker of time itself. And in a way, it's a landscape. I think I was thinking about how like time in a way, like we say it's always moving and changing, but really in some strange way, it also always feels like this kind of eternal moment at the same time. And really what ends up being the real change is our visual, what we're perceiving, right? And like these spaces that change, or that we move through. And that what is what is like, if you're just in a car, let's take a simple example, you're passing by quite a lot. And I think that could be a interesting thing to look at and think about in terms of building and space and perception, because I was thinking about this, how there is so much more that we pass by in a single, just depending on your stage of life, you might be driving every day or not every day or whatever. You might be a hobbit. But it's like there is a way in which you pass by so much more space and distance.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, and it's just like, this is a mind-boggling thing. Like to your point, there's the fact that we can kind of, we have a certain, and we're moving through that space in a certain structure. I don't know if you've ever heard, I haven't read it myself fully, but I've read like excerpts from like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance or something like that. He talks about like how riding a motorcycle, where you're literally like very close to, like there's nothing encapsulating you from your space, the space that you're moving through, versus a car where you are in a bubble. And so it talks about even the difference between what you are riding and how it changes how you are moving and through how you experience that movement through space. And basically, like, I just think it's really fascinating because we move through a lot more space than people ever used to. Or if they did, it would be by foot. They'd be walking it. It would be so much longer of a process. So it just adds to what we were saying off record before we started this, that like what we have a lot today is speed, right? And I wonder that there's probably some good and some bad to that, like everything, there's always pros and cons to everything. So in some ways, like, yeah, maybe that also can relate to a speedier cognitive process or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot we miss in that speed, right? Because you don't see all of the like, oh my gosh, there's that like, sugar maple. I didn't like you. If you were walking, you'd see that. If you were driving, you probably won't, or you might. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
or if it was just a little bit off down the way, where there's just a lot that gets like overlooked, basically, but there's speed, and there is that like the ability to get somewhere efficiently. So it's interesting because like there's always going to be trade-offs, like while you perhaps gain some cognitive, and that's good. Like I think that's just natural, right? Like you will have this sort of I mean, progress is a funny word, I think, but you will have some sort of change and transformation, and there'll be a lot of really rich, ripe things about that. But there also might be things that are different now that people perhaps, like for example, people used to be able to just tell the time by the sun.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, they'd probably be pretty good at that, but gauging that for the most part. And now, it's funny because even if we have a sense of what time it might be, we'll check, we'll check the time. If checking the time is not to look in the sky, it's to look at the phone, right? Or look at the appliance or whatever it is. So it's interesting because we maybe lost the skill of just knowing in intuitively what time it is. But we do have, so many other things that would be considered possibly advancements or like progression of cognitive ability. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like, so, yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Maybe just, I guess, it's funny because I think the car is a really good example of, I think it's kind of actually, if you think about it, at the time in history, I mean, a lot of stuff happened at this time in history, but you start to get a dawning of the consciousness, a dawning of like phenomenology when people start moving really quickly, and I think there's something like different about car travel is that, like you're moving, but there's no bodily locomotion.
Exactly. You're moving, but you're not moving.
Yeah. Like, legs are still, there's no muscles in your body moving. And that would have been a very weird experience probably initially for people who all their lives associated movement with like, and I mean, you would have things like horses where you would have had the same experience, but even that, it's really like you're engaging a lot of muscles when you're riding a horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, and suddenly you can just sit so stiff perfectly in a modern car, at least you can sit so perfectly still and silent, and you just are in this like perfectly still posture, and yet you're moving, and I think it's from that like from that experience we can sort of have this dawning of like, oh, experiences wash over me, like I go through the world like rather than like thinking of the space as the stationary reference point.
Oh,
You,
that's so good, yeah.
you know, you in a car, you kind of think of yourself as the stationary reference point, and everything moves around you. And I mean, I love road trips, and I have driven from Montreal to Victoria, and Victoria through Canada, and Victoria to Montreal through the US. And
Wow.
it's like such a great way to experience the country, because you get like a sort of like 3 days, like a 3 day melt of the country, you know, of the landscape. Or not 3 day, but I guess total, but it took me like 10. And it's, I think it gives you a new, you know, that's something where a physical experience, I think, helps you, and the same with bicycles, helps you to have a different way of thinking about experience in general. And yeah, I think, well, I forget. So that was to address the first part of what you had said. Please remind me where we went after that.
Yeah, I'm trying to like collect the thinking on that. Just the idea of like the card, space and time, spatial change being like what we understand as time. Well, I was kind of just asking, yeah, like also just the idea of how does the cognitive relate. But I think, you know, that example, like talking more through it with you, Sam, is helping me a lot to understand that connection better. And there was a part of me that's almost like, is it also the teaching of how to build certain, because okay, how to build certain structures, for example, used to be taught a lot more, right? Like more people probably knew how to build houses back, I don't know, let's just give it some hundreds of years ago versus now. Yeah. And also it's interesting because the designer and the builder would be probably the same person, or, you know, within a couple of degrees. Now it's interesting because there is, even it seems like we have more compartmentalization in buildings themselves. There's more compartmentalizing in the roles of builders today, right? I mean, you do the design. It sounds like you do design. Then there's going to be probably another team that does the actual building. And then there's the people who, you know, who oversee that, and then people who maybe have particular parts. And I think that's really interesting because that reflects buildings themselves, where there are these like different parts to them. And there's always been different parts to structures, and like, you know, just like layouts of cities, and like, you know, just how are they planned out and such. But it's interesting that there seems to be like, and also, I mean, it's probably a question of scale too. Like, how big are we talking? Bigger stuff's going to require more people, you know? And certainly, like, you know, people who were ruling a certain city might have certain designs that then they just had like workers do and make and whatnot. So it's like there's always probably been that level of sort of compartmentalizing, which, so maybe that's kind of different. I guess I'm kind of thinking more back to sort of like very rudimentary shelters, and maybe even like when people are exploring and they're literally just kind of like, I'm in this completely new territory and land, and I'm going to have to, you know, on a very small scale, like on the very rural family level, would be building things themselves, you know. I think in general, though, it's fairly like if an iron breaks today, like my dad would fix all these sorts of things for his parents. Like just like, here, you know, take the iron, go fix it and bring it back when it's fixed. And now it's like if somebody's iron breaks, it's usually like just get another iron. Just, you know, you don't really think to fix it really, a clothes iron or anything like that. So I guess there is kind of there's something about, like, I guess I've been thinking a lot lately about the how versus the what. I think there's a lot of emphasis on what in the West, and in the East a lot more about the how. And so there can be this kind of like completely talking past each other when they are discussing things or thinking about one another. And there can be a really beautiful dialect there, but unfortunately that can be missed, or we don't always appreciate just the depth of like what both can teach, right? But I guess I'm just thinking like the actual ability to build things, sorry, to bring it back, the actual ability to build things or know how to place tiles or, you know, build foundations and things like that. Do you think that, like, I wonder, because there's a part of me that's almost like, I wonder if you could, then this sounds so silly possibly and very abstract, but like, I wonder if you actually built foundations yourself and such, that it would give you a better sense of like why it's important to have certain foundations in your life on a metaphysical level of like values. I don't know. What are your thoughts there? It's a lot out there.
Yeah, I mean, so I also think about this a lot too because of dreams, you know, like so often you'll have a dream and it's in a house where you're completely disoriented, or then I'm in a house, or sometimes you dream of like I'll often dream of really fantastical buildings and um but they're like I'll have dreams set in a place that I know, but it's not that place in real life. It's like a fantastical place that I think is that place. Or like, you know, dreams where you go into a basement and then, you know, you read about psychology, you're like, okay, basement, subconscious, like these things seem to be internalized, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm.
I don't claim to be any I don't know what I think about that really, but I do see that like it's a part of our certainly a part of our emotional life, you know?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Well, it kind of gives us like the aesthetic building blocks for how to think about ourselves. You know, like like you're saying, the idea that there's like the basement could be the subconscious, or we have these. They're basically like become analogies or like metaphors for things in ourselves, right? And um, yeah, I think that's true, and I think that's going to happen whether you built the house yourself or not. Like,
yeah.
I think the only thing that possibly people being doing more hands-on building themselves could possibly do is just honestly, the biggest thing would be like learning that things take time, learning that there's like hard work involved in making a foundation.
Mhm.
That to me might be a simple thing that could be learned from that and continue to pass on as just a very fundamental human like lesson or life lesson or something. But I think that can certainly be found elsewhere. It doesn't have to be found explicitly in building per se. But I do
Yeah.
often find that very interesting that, and I think about this a lot with like technology, like even what we're using now. Like I think it's really interesting that a lot of stuff we use, we couldn't make ourselves with our current knowledge set. Now we could maybe learn it and then we could do it, but it would certainly take quite a bit of time. And there's something interesting to me about that. It's not necessarily bad or good. I don't know. It's just more this kind of sense of like that's interesting because the the things that people would have been using on a quotidian basis in the past would have been by and large like either they could make it or somebody within like 5 degrees of them could make it themselves.
Mhm.
And that's I don't really know. I'm not sure really what to think of that necessarily. Maybe in some ways, the fact that we can't make it makes it more like mysterious in a sense of wonder and like, wow, we get to use these technologies and they're so incredible and there's something kind of almost magical about them. So there, in that way, that could be a very good thing. But there can be a way in which, because we don't necessarily know how to fix them, like if it's kind of like we do feel more of the phenomenological distance and such when like you're having a technical difficulty, like everything's running very smoothly and it feels like very normal per se, like a normal perception or something like that, but almost like in the Heideggerian sense, when the doorknob doesn't work, then suddenly you're like thinking about it. And then you realize like, oh right, like I am talking to Sam, but we're together, but we're not together in a phenomenological space that's shared, but we are in this other type of quasi shared metaphysical space that is this, whatever this is right now.
Yeah.
But so I don't know, it's not like it's just interesting to me, this idea of like, oh, and I know like I can, because technology can be this sort of like, okay, it's not working, how do I get it to work? You know, like you refresh the connection, you do this, that, and together, and you see if it ultimately like cooperates or not. But there almost feels like that's when there can be a sense of frustration, like and maybe even helplessness, which maybe is good. Like sometimes we need to be reminded about like how helpless we are. but I don't know. I'm interested in like it's so yeah, I think the good that we can see in that is like the mystery and the wonder of it. And like, wow, we still get to utilize these tools almost in a childlike way. You know, children use things that they don't necessarily like make themselves, but they are really interested by them and curious by them, and they will still utilize them and build them. You know, it's just like they take blocks and build stuff, even though they're not really building a building, but they are still building. For them, it's real. You know, for them, you know, they are whatever they're pretending to be in that world. And so yeah, perhaps it could ignite more of that sense of wonder, curiosity, and imagination, and then utilizing those tools and technologies that perhaps we can't build ourselves but use all the time for good, and for connection and things like that. um but anyways, but the other day I reupholstered something and I was like, man, it feels good to use a staple gun. And like, you know, like it was like, I did this, I like made something, and it's just like, I don't know. I think being a dancer and like phenomenologically, like very much in, like, I appreciate the in my body sort of sense, and bodily, like I do appreciate just people being able to see somebody or make them banana bread or something like that, like where it's like, there's something that feels really like empowering in a good way. Like, yeah, power can be bad. I get that. But there's also something of this, a sense of like your own ability that is important as well. So that was a bunch of different things. I mean, I think they can be used in conjunction with each other. There's a good dialectic between the things we can do with our hands and make ourselves, and the things we can't make ourselves but use all the time. So yeah, what are your thoughts, Sam?
Well, I think I'm tempted to think of something that I haven't really asked this question of myself in a while, so this is a kind of a nice opportunity. And it's is the feeling of enclosure spatial, strictly spatial?
Mm.
Oh, I think I started to ask this question when I just started, there's a point where I started to pay more attention to language in my own life. And I think what I noticed is that language is very spatial. Is that abstract concepts usually they rest on objective metaphorical grounds. And another thing was just being a bookworm and a nerd and really feeling like having this aesthetic experience of just being totally lost in other worlds, as a kid, growing up, reading Harry Potter, reading Lord of the Rings. These books, in a sense, they really feel like they enclose you.
Yeah.
Like it feels like you enter into something. And I felt, and then also as a child, I played a lot of video games, and I felt that way about a few video games too, where I was so immersed in the story and the world and the perceived spaces. And it was just such a great feeling, it like maybe a bit escapist. I think I certainly read books as a mechanism of escapism, but in a bad way, but it's also a good thing, like
yeah.
each thing has like two edges to the knife. But yeah, and I began to ask myself, like, is virtual space a space? Like, how do we, is it an interior? Like, what are we doing where are we when we chat on Zoom? Things like that.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that we're definitely going to need to contend with in the future, because we'll need to have better understandings of these things. And another sort of dimension to that Substack post, my most recent one that we referenced a bit, is I recall in there I had said, like, I think that architecture is a psychotechnology.
Yeah.
And I think that it is. I think that we can like through architecture create immersive atmospheres, like from a completely embodied sense that affects, if it is like it is affective upon us, and it primes or conditions different social experiences, you know, like on like just having good lighting at a dinner party it changes the dinner party, right?
Yeah.
Like reading, I find reading in high ceiling spaces. I love reading
That.
high ceiling spaces. I don't know why. When I see low ceiling libraries, I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, and I don't even know why. I have no clue why. No, like I couldn't tell you, but yeah, I really think that's important. And yeah, so if you think of tech, like part of, you know, if I guess part of this overall, like why to build it all question is
Yeah.
build it all because there are things that need to endure into the future that we can't simply pass through the minds of everybody, and actually sometimes spatial and objective experiences of things like time give us new cognitive skills to understand time. So that would be like one point of why build it all. And I think another point of why build it all is we're complex social creatures and social and like and building these spaces helps modulate emotional experiences of gathering. Like, you know, like we build a temple to communion, and it changes the communion. We, you know, a dining room affects a dinner, right? Like, so that would be like point number two. And when we relate that to technology, it's like, okay, so if this is like a psycho in the sense of like cognitive, emotional, social technology, that like building. So if space is a technology, like is technology a space? Like what is the relationship between those things? And I think that the more we understand like the like the potential for ontological design that spaces have, I think we're also going to realize the potential for ontological design that like technology has. And I think they'll become kind of two of the same things, you know? We have virtual space, and that's sort of like the car where your body remains it remains stationary, but you do have an experience that's like which is representational of moving through a 3D space. And yeah, I mean, all this stuff really interests me. But I feel like we're not even able to ask those questions sometimes. Like we're partly because a lot of technologies are so like it's very easy to just it's almost certain that in 5 years we'll be like so much farther ahead with an awareness of technology, you know, like you know that there's unknown changes to come, and those unknown changes will only just like help us understand ourselves more, in the same way that a car, which was unknown to someone in the 1200s, you know, it was just there waiting for us, like to affect us. Kind of weird, actually, if you think of like latent in mountains and ores.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's super fascinating. And it is, I love the way you put that, Sam. And I love that idea of the psychotechnology that was from your piece. And yeah, I think that's really interesting to think like, is technology itself a space, you know, like this idea of like enclosure. And I think too, like I was thinking the other day a lot about escape and how like it's often thought about as bad, but like don't we escape every night when we go to sleep? To go back to your dreams point, like we all go to our dreamland. It's there, like it's just involuntary escape. And I mean, yes, I think we all welcome it, but there's something quite interesting that like our biology is designed to even have its own methods of escape too. And that's part of what keeps us alive and going. And that's what that's part of what keeps us able to be in the place of not escaping, right? Like where we stay and we embody and we occupy wherever we are, whatever we are doing. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. And I do think though it presents like, I wonder if technologies that then do in a sense become their own type of architecture or space, they create their own spaces. If, like you're saying, we just have to possibly just need to be more aware of that, because, you know, like I said, like we're always going to have some forms of escape, but there are some that are ultimately going to be, I want to say, like more functional, and some maybe that are, I don't know if I want to say less functional, but ultimately it's that the dialect would be good, right?
Yeah.
That the escape would then ultimately enhance the occupation, the occupying, whatever, the embodiment, and back and forth. That the embodiment would, just as like there's all that, like, you know, raw material for dreams that comes from our embodiment and our not escaping, then it feeds into our escaping and our dreams, and then it goes, you know, there's sort of this again feedback loop there. So I guess the thought is that with more abilities to, I don't know though. I'm not sure. Like, there's a part of me that's it's funny because like I do think that there's change in this in the cognitive sense that you're talking about. But there's these raw kind of human emotions and desires, right? That kind of always orient us one way or another. And I wonder if like, yeah, I guess it would make it more, there's more readily available for escaping. Like, let's just take video games, for example.
Mhm.
They would create another avenue for that. But, and then it would really be kind of, I don't know, determined by the person or their family, if like their parents were deciding how much time you had on playing video games or whatnot, on how much that was engaged with versus like the in real life type of engagements. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess there's just that idea that the awareness would be important so that the embodied and the escape end up enhancing each other and really working very well together, instead of like just one or the other being like just ascribed to ideologically almost, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you have any thoughts on that
Well, I guess so. Just in terms of the dialectic that you bring up,
yeah,
like that is really interesting to me because I think one of the major one of the things that architecture has historically done, especially in the history of Western architecture, is it's walled its cities, and it has created a very like thick line between inside the polis and the campagna, you know, like campagna, the like nature and culture. There's, you know, there's two in ancient city states that would have been really unambiguous. And so, you know, it's funny because it's like interiority and exteriority are a kind of funny thing phenomenologically. Like that was long, it was a very, very barely pronounceable sentence. But yeah, what makes the outside different than the inside? Like, why is an inside inner? Why is an outside outer? It seems pretty clear with things like bubbles or walled cities. Like it becomes, you know, very obvious. But I think it gets really confused in the idea, like when you come up, like the idea of a city in a present day situation, it's like, it's really not as simple because, you know, you have these sprawling suburbs, you know, you have things like, I don't know, sometimes valleys will come through cities where it just really wasn't a stable, like, or too steep to build on. And so you get these like sort of veins of nature running through a city, you know, and some cities you can drive on forever and it never seems to end really in certain parts of, you know, dense areas. It's like, what is nature? What is culture? It gets really unsure. And I think sometimes actually in the West, you can sort of think of, like, I think there's the possibility that if you could think of nature as everywhere, or you could think of the polis or the city as everywhere. There's just like these patches of nature that spring up inside of the polis. And I think that's kind of like what the Western mind wants to do, like more broadly. It doesn't want to leave any unmapped space, unaccounted for space on the globe, like in its entirety,
Yeah.
like there's literally like, like no room for mystery. There's no cave or lake at the bottom which lies any monsters. And but I think that it's important to have those spaces. Like I think that dialectic that you're talking about, and like insideness, outsideness, escapism, dwelling places. It's like, yeah, you could frame it as escapism, but like retreat is necessary, right?
Exactly.
Like
Exactly.
we could say, like, I don't know, like you could think of yourself as like escaping society, but at the same time, if you stay in the city like your entire life, like you might be missing something equally, like and yeah,
Yeah.
I think you see that like in, like um in the hero's journey, he always leaves home, whatever, what is home, whatever it is, he leaves it. He goes on an adventure, the space of the world around him structures the adventure, like you kind of see that in the Fellowship of the Ring too. Like, oh my God, getting so nerdy, but like
Hey, I love it. I love it.
the map in the Lord of the Rings is so essential to the story. Like you're constantly like flipping between the map and the writing because you're like, oh, there's a mountain pass, like what will be next? Like, then you've got a valley, you got to get to Lothlorien, like it's a journey over a topography, over a landscape. And like, so in the hero's journey, he leaves, but when he comes back, I think the kind of moral of that structure is that there is a renewed sense of why that home was important. And likewise, I think that in the separation of like city and nature, one of the good things, I don't know, no, I was never alive when there were city states, and I've never lived in a walled city, although I visited a few, but having that really definite boundary between nature and the city, and then constantly transgressing it, going inside and outside, escaping and returning, if you will. It makes apparent like two different modes, and I think it like gives a renewed sense of why culture is important. And when you leave and you go into the nature designated realm, it gives you a sense of like, yeah, why the culture was important. But then likewise, when you've experienced the nature sort of topography, and you come back to the interiority of the city, you realize why that's important, Yeah, and you build that dialectic just through like a spatial relationship that you've really just constructed, and is like mostly symbolic.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I'm really glad you brought this up, Sam, because ever since you and Javier talked weeks and weeks ago, I don't even know, weeks ago now, I remember you bringing up this point. I love that talk, and I remember you bringing up about this idea of the inside and the outside, and I wanted to like kind of hear a bit more about that and sort of just like the implications. And you guys did get into that a little bit, but I'm just happy to talk about it again because it really piqued my interest when I heard about it, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. And I lived in Spain. I traveled to a city that was a walled city, an older city called Cuenca, and it's a small city, but it was definitely kind of like the way that the city was structured. was, I mean, a lot of times, again, there was this thought of like, well, we will protect this domain here, and there's a lot of mountainous sort of, they built it up high basically, and but there was a wall to it, and it's very fascinating because a lot of times we think of doors as like into buildings or into a house, but this is like, these are walls into this little universe of like this city. And I've never really thought about, I mean, it was a very interesting experience to actually be in that type of a setting. And then we went out to a mountain like hike outside of it to look down upon the city. And it's very, there was a real sense of like, okay, now we're out in like the wilderness. And, and then in there is where like you could easily get to other people quickly, and like, not to again boil it down to mere protection or anything like that, but there is something that I think is really fascinating about the dialect that does kind of show our need for both danger and safety. Right? We need both in our lives, and like if we don't acknowledge it or sort of find either phenomenological experiences of it in some way, even if they're symbolic, they end up being very manifested. They create very manifested effects of like escape or sorry, like the escape and danger or the dwelling in safety, right? And I wonder now, because we have a lot of, we don't, not that I'm saying like, I don't know, there's always, again, like there's always trade-offs and pros and cons to everything. So I really don't know. I'm sure there's other, and even if without structural walled cities, we still have ways in which we feel these types of things, because like I think it's human nature to do that, where we kind of have like, where's your kind of walled in comfort zone, right? And now maybe we create them more mentally or something like that. And I was thinking about like, even with the walled cities, for people who lived outside of the city, for them, their escape would be to the city potentially, right? Because they don't get to be there very often. But for the people who lived in the city all the time, their escape's like to go out into the country, because that's not what they get to do very much, right? Or something like that. I mean, that have to be thought about a little bit more, but just to say the idea of like, there's something interesting about like novelty, right? There can be a risk in novelty, in this sort of like, in like a rapacious sort of thirst and hunger for just new experience that is in a way like never allows us to actually get in touch with the real, and real connection and real commitment, or real, just like what would be real life almost. But at the same time, there does seem to be like, again, just a dialectic that is necessary, and every person's dialectical balance is going to be different, right? And I think that like this idea of being able to, like I think something that could be helpful about having somewhat novel experiences of like these types of outside experiences is that when you come into the inside, like you're saying, there's this deeper appreciation for what that inside holds. And I don't know, like I think there's something that I kind of sometimes do wonder about, like just the idea of like novelty as more of a phenomenological thing versus just merely material or something like that. Or like there's also the novelty of just engaging with human beings, right? And in a deeper, more profound way, that creates a whole wealth of novelty as well. So there's different types of novelties that can be experienced, but I'm very interested in that. But I will say that today, like, okay, to get back to kind of what I want to bring up here is like, we have a bit more of an erosion of the inside and outside spaces, right? Or like, we don't have walled cities and then the nature. So, but we still sort of create these sort of walled space, and maybe it is as literally as basic as like, here's my home, it's a walled space. And then I go out into like the woods, and that's like the nature. I mean, that's certainly kind of what, if I had to just think, that's probably what it feels like, around here. Like the home is where it's walled in, and then, you go outside and it's the farm and the forest and all of that. But it's not done on a communal level. Like it's weird. It's like it's communal in the sense that it's for your family structure or your families, like if you have families that live near one another. But there's something like, I wonder if, I don't know, it does make me wonder if sharing the like everyone kind of having the commonness, like everyone would acknowledge like, where is the inside space, where is the outside space, and everyone sort of ascribing to that and knowing that somehow like created, I don't know, like would that possibly help with sort of a sense of like placement communally or something, or like, I don't know. I guess I keep on thinking too, like about isolation and this idea of the erosion of distinct spaces, making uh, isolation more like of a propensity or like a risk or something like that, because we really do have like, I did this talk that I never published on like the inversion of the public and private spaces because of technologies. And
Yeah.
so that's, again, it's not necessarily good or bad, but it's something to be aware of, and how does it impact us, you know? And so like, you know, you're talking about the caves that we don't really have room for in the like the Western perspective, like everything needs to sort of be mapped out and charted and stuff like that. And it's like, but it's funny because we still have this sort of like human desire to sort of like have a cave. We find a cave in like our internet use or something like that, or like in phone usage or something like that. So there's something really fascinating about that. And I wonder though, if those things being done on a more just again like agreed upon fashion or something would make it more like you well, also they didn't have certain technologies like phones back when they were walled cities, but like if there would be something that was maybe made people less at risk for isolation, I don't know, or I mean maybe it was just as possible. Then what are your thoughts, Sam?
Hmm. I think some, I think, okay, within architecture today, there's a lot of studies that correlate like qualities of space and things like um, things like fear and anxiety.
Mm.
And you get trends, you get like there's a certain amount of environmental stimulus which is too low for human to be comfortable, and then likewise there's environmental stimulus that gets too high for human to be comfortable. And I think you see this when you just like walk through a city. Like if you have to walk along a sidewalk which is uniformly paved in an industrial part of town where each power line is like 50 meters apart and the walls are completely blank, like you speed up your walking and you really dislike that walk. It's uninteresting, like, and you might try to mentally escape, because there's really nothing, it's just completely uniform, there's nothing to engage with. Likewise, but there's a Goldilocks zone, right? And I think those are just what I would call like really good old growth cities. You get that when you get a lot, like I could walk anywhere in Rome and I would feel like I'm always in that Goldilocks zone,
Yeah.
Rome is such an old city, it's been like built up over so many, like literally millennia,
Yeah.
but in that Goldilocks zone, you walk at a comfortable pace, you pause, you might speed up, and your attention is varied. And whether you're with people or not, whether you're even like focusing or noticing, or you're just totally maybe lost in your own mind, and the visual affect is just in your peripheral vision, and the I think sense is like a holistic, perception is holistic, but I think peripheral vision is something we don't really, um, peripheral vision is like the zone of architecture. Like if your peripheral vision is happy, you're probably in like a really nice place. And then likewise, you get other spaces that are totally like overstimulating, and it's like you also want to escape. It's hard, and in those kind of situations, like there's also a quality to the stimulus, to the stimulus, and usually there's a sharpness involved. Like like I kind of think of like Daniel Levy. Okay, Daniel Leveskin, sorry, man, but you build sharp buildings. They are pointy. They're getting at you. And I always bring them up as the example. Like, it's just, like if you look at studies that look at qualities of objects, and then like psychologies, it's like, those are like anxiety spaces, you know, cold, sharp, pointy spaces. Like it's not just like overstimulation, it's like a too much of a type of stimulation. And I think it's like these kind of, I think it's these things which contribute to isolation, which contribute to paranoia, which contribute to anxiety, insofar as there is like a built source to those things. You know, like,
Yeah.
It's not like if you're engaging in mechanisms of escapism in like living inside of a city, it's probably because you might feel overstimulated, but not just by the built world, but that's one of the dimensions, you know. And likewise, I guess, like if you felt like, I don't know, you know, if you were living, I mean, I grew up in a small town, not that small, but you know, like I felt bored, I felt malaise, I felt like understimulated for sure. And then you also engage in a kind of escapism because you need more stimulation. So I think it's like that Goldilocks zone, you know, whether you're partitioning time or space or texturing time or space, like there's a Goldilocks zone and we like to be in that. And I think there's like, you know, in the Renaissance, architects were associated with doctors because it was believed that architects could promote health. And like in a way, like at that point in time, that was true because good infrastructure, you know, like a good sewage system would actually mean good health for the people, you know, like good infrastructures meant health in urban spaces. But likewise, I think maybe we've got like we've got the sewage systems down, and it's more like the subtler forms of health that the West isn't so good at, like like helping with anxiety and things like that we need to focus on.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. No, that's really good. And I do like, I've been thinking a lot about, it's funny that you would bring up like just this idea of how a space is actually like felt, you know, like there's a presence that spaces in present, and how you engage with them. And there's a totally different feeling, like you're saying, with high ceilings versus low ceilings, you know, if there's stained glass, if what are we working with here? What are we talking about here? And how does it smell? What does your voice sound like in there, in that space? And I think like all of those perceptions and all of the senses, like you're saying, is a very holistic experience, full body experience. I guess because I've been thinking a lot about like art, and I just finished the book called Modern Art and the Death of a Culture by Rookmacher, and it was very good. But it did get me thinking about objective experience, subjective experiences. And like I do think that there is something very important, and almost like when you get full, there's something that's like so, I don't know, it's almost like the fullness of subjectivity coalesces with the fullness of objectivity or something like that. But there's something about the fact that everybody on the whole more or less has a general sense of like, I feel anxious in this overstimulating, sharp, hard, cold, you know, place, versus like the warmness of like, you know, the softness or the embracing of certain types of places, or the exquisite, majestic feeling of certain places and their enormity and their height and their, you know, their how they all are all encompassing of those in that presence. And so people feel like on the whole can feel that, like, or just what do people have hanging up on their walls, or like the fact that somebody took the time to put gladiolas on their table or something like that, you know, like there's just something about those things that make, on the whole, there's a sense of what's pleasant and what kind of feels embracing, and then what feels sharp and aggressive and uninviting in a sense, right? Like, and I guess in a sense, all humans kind of like desire both the embrace and the aggression. There's something about that, like there's something about the teasing nature of aggression and frustration that's a part of life, and the sort of playfulness, just like little cubs play, they try to fight each other, you know, they're like playing.
Yeah.
But there's also just the sense of like the sense of space to even have the possibility of feeling like at ease, and sort of like feeling sort of not feeling drawn more into it. And I don't know, I just think that's very, very interesting then, because then it's sort of like, it does matter, like what types of structures we are building or in or engaging with. And I I don't know, going back to the walled city question really quick, or the topic, if you don't mind me going back to that, because these things do matter, not that we can ever say that there's like some like, rainbow unicorn utopia of existence. There never is. It's always going to be trade-offs. But
Yeah.
like, do you think that, I don't know, if it was like your personal opinion, would you like reinstate walled cities? Like, do you think that would be better for people? And do you think like it's just possibly not, I don't know, is it just not the same now though with technology, like with the fact that people have private spaces, even in public places like their phones? So anyways, what do you think?
Like if I were to just in isolation ask, would I reinstate walled cities? I would say just like, no, I don't think we can just be like, oh, that'll
Sure,
fix it.
sure. Sorry guys, like rolling out.
We just need walls. But like if you think about like, okay, if we took my hometown, we just stuck a wall around it, what would that do? Well, like it would stop it from getting bigger. So everything else in there would get denser. It would get more like the medieval wall, like or ancient walled cities. Like there are some good things to limits, like and I think that architects used to know that a lot better than today. Yeah. But I think like when you're talking about objective versus like fullness of objectivity and the fullness of subjectivity, this really made me think of a thing in architecture right now, which is a kind of like identity crisis to the discipline.
Interesting.
For most of the profession, you would have apprenticed with an architect to become an architect. And what exactly that meant would have been different at different times, because I mean, like if you think of like Gothic church buildings, like you don't really have an architect, you had a master mason, and it would be just likely that like he would have apprenticed his son because the project took like 150 years to complete, like it's just which I guess also goes back to your like thinking of architecture as like a process and not just like a thing, which is very important and something, again, I think modernity is really bad at thinking about. We just think of this isostatic, just like a house, just complete, like where it is kind of a recipe, like we need a recipe of architecture sometimes that is as good as the final configuration of rooms. But so that's a bit of a tangent, but so as architecture went from being like an apprenticeship, and then you have the universities beginning, and then you would have began to study just like you would have just studied something general and then apprenticed, and then you get the opening of like architecture as like a discipline in the universities. And then additionally you get engineering coming along, and at this present moment, I think architects are like, what are we supposed to do? All the HVAC, all the plumbing, all the structure is handled by engineers. There's like landscape architecture has become its own discipline. And so we're really like legally, like we do the fire safety, and we do envelope performance. Like that's, like if it falls down, it's not my fault. Like, but if it burns and everyone dies, then it is my fault. Well, I'm not a stamped architect, so it's not my fault. It's still not my fault. But like an architect would be a fault legally, but it's like, you have to have more than just a legal like purpose, right? And so I think there's this idea of like, what is architecture? And there was a time when it was taught as within the arts, And then it moved into like a lot of architecture programs are now within the engineering faculty. Like my undergrad was like a BSci. Um, and uh, and then there's this emerging discipline called like building science, which is kind of taking over things like envelope design. So like, this is very technical, but like, the way that you layer assemblies, like will perform better and worse in different contexts. Like you don't want mold if you have a pool, an indoor pool, so you need to have a different wall assembly than if you're just having a dry space, things like that. And so they've taken to studying that. But to bring it back, I really think like it is important for architects to maintain a social intelligence and a subjective intelligence. And because I think they're thinking, oh, we have no more objective intelligence left to offer our communities when we're doing our practice, because objective intelligence in terms of like how forces move through buildings have been given to different disciplines. But I think this because it's not necessarily that if we just build spaces in the Goldilocks zone of environmental stimulus, that we're just going to be good all of a sudden. Because even that is a type of uniformity, is homogeneity. And like, there are times when the sharp, cold, alienating experiences are really like important. Like the Holocaust Museum, I forget where it is. I think it's in Israel. And I forget the architect, which is really bad, but it uses concrete, it uses darkness, it uses contrasting shadows and echoiness to create an atmosphere in which you're able to like introject one of the worst, crimes of humanity, like, and it's important to be in that mood. Likewise, like, if you go to a rave, you want environmental stimulus, you want to be overstimulated. If you need space to like reflect or to grieve, you might need like a very empty space, right? Like that would be inappropriate if you needed to say work in that space. And it's like, it's this social intelligence, and phenomenological intelligence that I think is really important for us to like hold on to, and like understanding the life cycle and the emotional potential of places, and then attuning what we produce to those potentials is it has the possibility really of really helping people,
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. I think that was really great. And yeah, I guess it just makes me think though that like the idea that spaces do actually really help people and make a difference. Like I've always, I mean, since I was younger, I've always like wanted to be like, I had, when you're a kid, you're like, I'm going to be this one day, or I want to be that one day, I want to be this one day. Definitely one of the things on my list was like interior designer. Like I loved spaces and just like the way things could feel just because of how you rearrange the furniture, or just things like that. And I think that there are people who have just like I wouldn't even say I have an eye for it necessarily, but there are definitely people who have like really have an eye for it, really have an eye for that sense of like how to make something, like how to make a house feel like a home, etc. How do you make a place feel more inviting, or how's the lighting going to change things. But it's, I guess this is kind of going back to this interesting kind of thought I've been thinking about with the subjective and objective, where it does make a difference. And there is something like, if you can generally have a sense of what helps people. Now, yes, you would still need to know, who are you helping? Like, are we talking about teenagers? Are we talking about grownups? Are we talking about little kids? Are we talking about elderly people? Are we talking about people who've been through like abuse? Are we talking about people who've been through, like some sort of, whatever it is, like if that have been translocated or in different, like aren't in their home anymore and that need to feel a sense of home. So there's all sorts of things that you would need to know the particulars of. But there's something interesting to me that like there are certain things that on the whole seem to make a similar impact to people, right? So there's this interesting thing that it's really just this kind of idea that like the ability to say, like where it's like, this is actually cozier feeling or more intimate feeling. And then this over here feels like, I really just, this feels very off-putting or whatever it is. And I think you're totally right too. Like there's times like the rave situation versus like contemplative, like, grieving or reflecting or, having a place where, people are going to gather a lot, and just like even logistics, like, is there going to be enough seating for that? But like, how can also feel like, everyone can pull up a chair or whatever. And I just like, I think that's really interesting because then it's sort of like, there's something kind of common to like something that everyone can at least resonate with. And that is something that I want to say is universal, but it's like, it's kind of like, it's something, I don't know how to put it. It's like, it's something that everyone can resonate with. So there's something kind of common about it, but yet it can't ever be thought of as merely a universal or merely a common, because it is going to be particular to the situation, to the circumstance of the person, to their culture, all of those things, but it's like, I do think that's, I don't know. It's kind of like when we get into, I'm just obviously really thinking a lot about this book on modern art, because suddenly, like, yes, it was trying to make a statement, but it was taking art and making like what we used to think of as something that would be toward beauty, truth, and goodness, or towards the sense of like making something more aesthetically pleasing. It was like destroy, and we destroy that, and we still are going to call it art in a sense, or we maybe are reluctant to call it art. We want to maybe call it anti-art or something like that. But it's weird because even in an attempt to be nihilistic, you're still making something, So there's just something really interesting about that, because while on the one hand, I definitely feel like there's a place for like, it's just expression. Art is merely expression. Yes, it is in a sense. And if you're doing that in your own experimentation to process your feelings and to like explore more of yourself and a sense of self in an almost art therapy type of way, that makes total sense. But the thing is that what happens is art gets and has an impact on the culture. So that's where I think it's going to matter, right? What we're calling something that should be, I don't know, like incorporated into like daily aesthetic or like into a mindset. And that's where it's like, well, yeah, it's like, it is mere expression, but it's also like, it does have impacts. So there is something where it's like, we're always in relation. So maybe just kind of the mere remembering that like what we make is going to be seen or perceived by other people, and that will make a difference. It will make have a particular affect on them. And so I don't know, that I've talked about that in kind of like very vague terms, but in a sense, but I'm just really interested in this interplay between like subjective and objective, really.
Yeah. I think like it needs to be in vague terms, so you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'm tempted to think of one thing, which is like something I try to always remind myself when I'm at work, and I try and always hold others accountable to, is the idea that like, who is the space for? Who are you responsible to? Who do you feel responsible to? Because you're always going to be making decisions when you're creating something. Who are those decisions for? And I think, especially like in the 60s, there was the idea of, and today I think we have it in the idea of starchitects. There's like this grand author, or like, the architect is the creator of the city. And I mean, like we talked about before, so many people are involved. It's hardly ever the case that this person has full control. But there is, I think, a tendency in some people in the discipline to wish they had full control over every decision. And you try and take full control of every decision. But you really, if you're making a decision in a situation, I think it's really important to remember, like, a building is never hardly ever for one person. The closest you get to that is with a house. And usually that's for at least more than one person, although it might be for one person. And then, after that person dies, it's going to be for somebody else, So there is an idea of the public as a whole that really needs to be considered, and there needs to be, again, an intelligence for what that entity needs, because it might not be in your taste, in your personal taste. It might not be in your personal expression. That being said, I think that how innovation does work is through this type of individualistic experimentation. I think, like, it takes an individual to introduce an aesthetic, and then the public resonates or not.
Yeah.
Whatever that public is in whatever time and place. And that's when I think you get things where a sweet spot is not necessarily thought up and created, but is found. And I guess I would point to, like, what I had said earlier about old growth cities. There's a sort of Lindy effect present in an old growth city where things get built, they get taken down, new things get rebuilt, and then you get this, like, palimpsest of different intentions and different times, different like aesthetic ideals, all like compounding in one place, and eventually it just works its way up into like this beauty that no one author could ever have, like, themselves dreamt. And I think those are really the best. That's where the Goldilocks zone is sweetest, like, I find. And I think that's, like, you walk through newer cities, like North American cities, where that kind of mechanism hasn't had the time to elapse, and also construction processes that are our current time being so fast that you can build an entire city, like, in a year or less. It's crazy, so crazy.
Yeah.
So you are reliant on, like, probably just a few authors in those situations, and again, within this really narrowed down, like, set of aesthetic ideals, intentions, like material sources, like craft processes, like, yeah. So if it's vague. Yeah. But I think it's importantly vague because it's, like, found rather than made.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And I think I really like the way you put that, Sam. And I think that's quite, yeah, well said. Like, the fact that it's vague too is, like, you can't point to any one particular person. It's an emergence, right? It's an emergence of, like, relation and how these things relate to one another, and how these things are built upon one another, and sort of how these things are brought together. And like you said, then suddenly it's almost like it's not ever, it's kind of like it emerges out of that the dance of elements or something like that, or the coming together, like a harmony in a sense of different things. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that's why perhaps the challenge with art is that, especially when it's compartmentalized into like, I mean, this is not, I enjoy museums and galleries and things like that. But when it is compartmentalized in a sense, not that there's always places wrong for that. We need to have, in a sense, why have spaces at all? Like, there's going to be some compartmentalizing. But what I mean to say is that, like, there's something kind of specimen-like that art there's a risk for with art, where it becomes in a merely observational measuring type of way do we look at it? Do we sort of like, you know, we don't engage so much as we make it a specimen to observe, right? And I think that observation is not the witnessing that we really need. The witnessing is the type of acknowledgement and engagement with it that is so fundamental to it being a fuller experience. And I think that's why, like, honestly, probably the exhibitions and that I've enjoyed always the most is like when I like literally either it's relational, like I'll never forget my brother took me and my twin sister to the Philadelphia Museum of Art once, and it's a beautiful museum. It's a beautiful city, but the experience was so formative and memorable because my brother was taking us, and like we're very different. Like me and my twin sister are very different from my brother, but we're siblings. It's just how it goes. Sometimes you're very kindred spirits, and sometimes you're like, well, we're siblings, we love each other, like we'll help each other out, but like you don't have like some sort of like talk every day type of bond or something. And so, but the fact that he like took the time to take us and show us around and like talk to us about the paintings from like his art history class and stuff like that, it was, it made like the whole experience really, really beautiful, and something that again was something of value to me, and actually made the art much more enjoyable, because otherwise I don't know exactly, like, there's a way in which it's like you see it and because it's in a museum, you're like, oh, this is supposed to be art, this is important, and yes, like I think that art is very important. That's why I'm very, very interested in reading books about it and such. But like it's there's a way in which we have this mirror idea of like, it being a specimen and either being reduced in that way or almost feeling reduced under it because it's art and it's important and it's very meaningful. And if you don't get it, that's just your problem, And so I think there's this very interesting dynamic that happens in that way where like art is a very unique case to look at, because it does often have this separatedness to it that is not very true today, like daily life, where daily life is where we see the total kind of immersion of things, and like the inseparability. Like, yes, there are separate spaces and everything, but like there's this moving through it and this sort of like human element there. Like it's just very interesting to me. I'm very interested in art because it's like it's a silent speaking, like it talks to us, but it's silent. But what exactly is it saying? We're very distanced from the author, so we can't ask them. It's not words, so we're not like hearing the person's ideas in it, but it is in a way emotions and things that are captured in like still like in a frozen time that are then on display. And so there's something sort of strangely like prison-like about art, but at the same time, it's like this, it can tap into because it can tap into the human emotions and affects and affections and all of that, and beauty and wonder, that it can actually be very liberating. So it's a beautiful place of like all sorts of paradoxes. But the point of what I wanted to say though is like that I think that the risk is that it does kind of get thought of as like just not really like, unfortunately it's thought of as not practical. It's not like how does it impact like our daily lives, but like architecture really shatters all of our thinking of things as separate, because it's like, well, these are the spaces we're in, like these are the spaces we're inhabiting, these are the spaces we're moving through, these are the spaces we'll like, that people build families in, and like connections and friendships and relations and all of that. So yeah, I think the more we like understand the process, is all I'm really saying, the process and the relations that go into these things, then the more that we ultimately could like always have them, like perhaps like the Goldilocks is that idea, right? Like is that idea of the immersion, the relations that really are behind it, and this intergenerational process that then like leads us to where we are today. And like ultimately that's also like a lot of it comes down to like this real idea of like love of the craft, or love of like people, that then makes you want to make an inviting space or whatever, or just like merely somebody being like, I just love this color, I just really want to make this whole thing this color blue because I just love this color. So there's something really interesting about like how you can it's almost like when they talk about like love is a secret ingredient in like some recipe, like where, or it's, mom made it, it's like better. Just these things like that, where I almost feel like you get the human touch, you get the really human element in these types of more, what did you call them? Old grown cities, or
Yeah, yeah.
okay, yeah. And then like that's another thing too that really interests me, because with more mechanization and such, we can, like you're saying, we can build cities like really quickly, but we also literally don't have like the human touch on artifices and like structures and stuff like that. Like we have steel, metal, we have machines. So it's weird because like before you would see like the human element of something being made, right? Like, and now it's like, even if it was done very, very perfectly, there'd still be some sort of like literal human touch or their own senses in it. Whereas now we have like all of the flatness and what, and like the structure, which again, not bad, but the one, I wonder if we lose like that dynamic human element of it. Like literally fingertips are not touching these things to make them as much anymore. And so I don't know, like perhaps we see ourselves as needing to be more structured. And then when we realize like we're actually just a ball of chaos, or like whatever, we're like just a complete, like, chaotic mess, as we can sometimes feel as humans, we feel like out of place, but really like, no, like we actually are like this entropy in a sense. There's a lot of chaos that we find in ourselves, and that's okay. Like you find an order in that, but it's like this ebb and flow between the order and the chaos. Whereas if it's like perpetual structure, there's like, there must be something wrong with me. And it's like, no, you're just a human. I don't know. A lot of thoughts there, Sam.
Yeah. So it's hard to think about these things, I think, because there's no direct mechanisms. And we're really bad at thinking about things without like objective mechanisms. And I guess I'm talking to you today, and I'm presenting to you my thoughts, but not necessarily my feelings on the discipline. Like this is our first like long form conversation as two individuals together. But I guess so things are flatter, things lack the impressions of human bodies, like objects lack the impression of human bodies. But actually, I don't think it's like that smoothness that is actually the problem. Like I think of like, if you think of objects, like some of the most important objects in my life are, related to dead people. My stepdad died recently, and I've been wearing his coat a lot. I have a friend, her dad was a glass blower, and she's got all of his vases in her house. And vases are very smooth. They're very like, but like he himself created them, know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so
that's a good point.
It's not the smoothness, but there's an irreducible reality, like it's like a lineage of cause and effect, but that sounds really way more materialistic than I'd care to be, but like because there's like this, there was this distant intention he had to make a vase,
Yeah.
and then there's like this whole unfolding, and now he's no longer with us, and here I am, a friend, just admiring the heart of her vase collection,
Exactly.
and and these things are real presences in the objects, and yet when we're making objects, we don't really like acknowledge an object's ability to do those things. Like you said, like, art gets relegated to galleries and looked at like specimens, and architecture likewise, it gets placed as photos in a magazine online, and judged on on a certain set from a very narrow perspective, visually, digitally visually too. And yeah, it's like this weird dissection of the thing itself, of the object itself, and it's also like a dissection of the object from as we're identifying from living. Like if you were grieving something, like actually, I don't know why I thought of this particular painting, but maybe I would really love to be with Van Gogh's potato peelers.
Mm.
The thing is that Van Gogh, you know, he was just a man, and his art was unimportant at one point in time. And then it became more and more important. And now I think we put it in galleries as priceless pieces because it's so important to this overall like accumulation, like accumulative force of culture. Like it started as a seedling of influence and grew into an oak tree, you know.
Yeah.
And so it becomes priceless, and we should put it in galleries because in a gallery it's accessible by the public. It's not just owned by one person.
Yeah.
But then you have this movement of contemporary art where everything gets sold through galleries, and you think it's the same thing, but it's actually just like a place where the speculative value of the piece can be like increased just by a sort of theater, right? Of like putting it in a white box with a concrete floor. And in a lot of those situations, those pieces aren't really like participating in anybody's lives. And I think what I really like about architecture is very hard to like completely gallerize architecture. It's very hard to completely like dissect it from life because we live, you know, and our lives are lived out within them. And so like, even if we are like celebrating them mostly like from a really narrow vantage point in magazines, nonetheless, like, you know, the builder who built my grandma's kitchen will never know what he gave me, you know, when we were cooking, baking cookies, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and I try to keep these things in mind, which are more, I guess, like a sort of spiritual disposition towards architecture, because it's really hard to objectify what that even means.
Yeah.
But as somebody participating in this whole like building like endeavor of man, like I think it's important to keep those things in mind and not just kind of get tempted into like the easy way of like just being like the easy culture, the easy celebration of just making something suited to magazines, for magazines, you know, for discourse, and to actually still try and participate in lives.
I love that.
Even if you know, that's literally a mystery. How I will participate in the lives of the patrons in my buildings, like I have no clue, but I really hope and I intend personally that for goodness out of that, like what else can you do, you know?
Yeah, no, that's so good. That's so good. And that's kind of, yeah, like that's the whole, when we realize like that is at the heart of it, right? Like that's when I think that's when we really see like beauty and like all of this idea of like the idea of actually being able to provide something to help other people, to provide something of value that they can make their own value within. You know, that's really what it is all about ultimately. And what I think makes for the greatest art and the greatest, you know, architecture and the greatest cities and things, when you see that like, this is created for like, you know, human beings to connect and relate and, you know, ultimately flourish with one another. Make places are like, you know, spaces are places for memories, you know, making memories. And yeah, it's funny because it's buildings and you're always building something within them too, right?
Yeah, it's this constant like intrification, like creating intricacy, you know, within and within and within, because, you know, somebody made your house, but then you got in there with all your little objects and you started arranging them, you know, like, and that's within the city. And but yeah,
I love that. Like making it more intricate, more and more intricate.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Oh, Sam, this has been so good. I feel like we talked for 5 minutes. I literally feel like I literally feel like we talked for 5 minutes. I'm not joking you. Like, I'm like, what even?
Yeah. I was like, oh, maybe I'll like pivot to the Japanese gardens, but I was like, no, this is good. We'll just go with it. Who cares?
You know, but we should talk about Japanese gardens though sometime, because that would be, we should do a part 2 where we talk about Japanese gardens. I would love that, because that's in and of itself would just be like, there's so much there too.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about Japan because I was like, honestly, like some of the greatest art to me is like anime. Like it's just like, and that's where it's like it's such an impact of like I'm engaging with it in like a in a more, you know, your private setting of your own home, but like I don't know, it's like some really good video games too, where you're just like I'm in this whole other world, and like my heart is just like exploding with all these feelings and thoughts, and I'm just like I don't know, like, isn't that ultimately what art's supposed to do, you know? And like architecture is supposed to do is connect us to like our own sense of humanity and like even like thinking too about like just what makes life like feels valuable, you know, feel worthwhile and you know worth it. So anyways, yeah, I would love to talk with you about Japanese gardens again sometime or some we'll have to talk about that topic sometime together. That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank
Oh,
you so much.
Michelle, this was great.
This is wonderful. Really sincerely appreciate your time. And I really loved hearing your thoughts so much. So thank you so much again. And we will do this again soon. Thanks, Sam. Bye.